So as mentioned, my name is Richard Porter, and I'm a product manager at IBM with API Connect. And you might be surprised because the session says 0 to API testing hero. Well, surprise, I changed the session. I got to be honest with you, one of my colleagues booked this speaking gig originally, and he was all about taking people from 0 to API testing hero in a specified amount of time. And I got to be honest, that's just not me. But don't worry, it's still about API testing and monitoring. There's just a slightly different flavor to it now. My story to tell is a little bit different than his story to tell is. So one of my subspecialties is API Connect Test and Monitor, which is your alternative to our good friends out here at their own booth, Postman, for powerful automated API testing and monitoring. So what makes my story a little bit different? Well, the reason that I decided to change the name and change how I'm going to present this information is I've been reading a ton of Simon Sinek lately. I don't know if any of y'all have read it, but I really like the way he puts that it's important to start with a why. And I've been driven by my own personal why for quite some time. And my personal why is to learn and teach so that others can thrive and survive by understanding knowledge. And I've done this a few different ways throughout my life. I did it as a smart alecky kid when I was in high school and college, always spouting off about whatever book I'd read most recently, and maybe that hasn't changed too much from what I just said. But then for a while, I did that as a US Marine. And I worked in intelligence when I was in the Marine Corps. And there, the learning and teaching so others could survive and thrive through knowledge took on a very literal sense. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about what does stepping off on a patrol with a bunch of US Marines have to do with testing and monitoring your APIs. It's more than you might think. So back to starting with why. At IBM API Connect, we have a why also, and I think it's this. We create software to help companies, developers, enterprises do something that's very difficult to do, to be both secure and open at the same time with their APIs, so that the consumers of their APIs, and some of us in this room may be consumers, some of us may be providers, and some of us may be both, so that the consumers of those APIs can unleash their own creations and create their own value for the world. That's why we're all here. Previous speakers have been talking about the lack of developers in the world that need to be actually creating this value. So this helps everybody scale that impact by empowering their consumers. So who are we serving? Well, we have these personas as concepts, and there's lots of different types of API providers in the world. There might be an API developer. There might be an API product manager. It's important to manage your APIs as products. There might be an API operations persona who's responsible for making sure that all of this stays up and running. It's actually functional. There could probably be an API security persona in here also with our friends at Ping Intelligence. But in the end, this is all about the API consumer, right? That's why we're here. We're providing something to someone who needs it. So as an API provider, you have to ask yourself, how do my APIs look to my API consumer? Are they functioning the way that the consumer expects? And so I'm going to bring it back to the same question I asked. What does stepping off on a patrol have in common with testing and monitoring APIs? Well, I'm asserting that it has more in common than you'd expect because we were drilled in the need to always inspect what we expected. So you expect your APIs to perform in a certain way for your consumers. Well, you better be inspecting that. And I'm going to share a little bit with you about how we do that with API Connect Test and Monitor, and then piece by piece, a little bit on how that is analogous to preparing for a patrol. So first, we'd have something we called pre-combat checks. Next, we'd do something we call pre-combat inspections. And then after both of those were completed, we could step off on a patrol, but we needed to continue our radio checks and continually monitor. We're going to step through each of those, and then we're going to tie them in as analogies. It's going to be great. Pre-combat checks. This is where you make sure that you have what you need with you to do the job. This is the basics. Do we have the ammunition we need? Do we have the equipment we need? Does anybody jingle if they jump up and down because they're wearing something that's metal and it makes noise? This is a basic functions test, and here you see one of our lieutenants climbing on top of his vehicle, making sure that the 40mm grenade launcher is set up with all the ammunition it needs before we go out on our vehicle-mounted patrol. But this is far from enough. This just means you have the right gear for what you need to get done. You also need to have pre-combat inspections. Pre-combat inspections, and this sometimes throws people a little bit because I guess for some reason the wording changes around in their mind, but in the Marine Corps, pre-combat inspections has to do with the information, with the format, with the data. What frequencies are we going to talk on when we get on the radio? What format do the reports need to be in? What kind of information do I need to be able to convey and receive from the patrols that are out to the headquarters that's receiving them, and vice versa, to get done the jobs that we need to get done. This image is me and one of my lieutenants getting prepared while he launches very hastily out on a patrol in the middle of a very chaotic situation. You can see blurred in the background there, an ambulance has just come back. And he's about to go out and secure an area, and we've trained for this and we've prepared for this, but he has to very rapidly get out there. And even so, we still have to quickly synchronize and make sure in our pre-combat inspection that we both understand the formats we're going to be using to report and that everybody's on the same page. And then after we've already done both of those, that's still not enough. Just because you have the gear that you need, just because you understand the formats of information you're going to use to communicate, that doesn't mean that it's going to continue to function. It's going to continue working at all times. So you need to do continuing radio checks. And here you see one of our senior enlisted leaders checking in on the radio. He's taking advantage of having already conducted those pre-combat inspections, and he's sending a very simple check. You, this is me, radio check, over. We already know from our pre-combat inspections that that just means everything is fine, nothing has changed. If something has changed, we also know the format to report that in, whether it's contact, whether it's need for medical evacuation, whether it's need for resupply. We have all of those established already, and we synchronized on those in our inspection. So, pre-combat checks, do we have all our gear? Does everything function? Do the weapons and radio work? Pre-combat inspections, do we know the plan? Do we make sure that all of our data formats are the same, that we're going to be referring to the same rule book, that we're all going to understand what the content is? And then continuing radio check. Every 30 minutes or some set period of time, we're going to check in with each other and make sure things are still going okay. And if they're not, we're going to let each other know what we need. So, back to why you're here, testing and monitoring your APIs. For pre-combat checks, you need a simple hello world check. You need to make sure that when you call that API, it returns a response. That it actually has the content of what it's supposed to have. Did it bring the gear it needed to bring to get the job done? Then pre-combat inspections. Inspect and validate that API. Make sure that not only is the content what it appeared to be, but that it meets the conditions that you've already set for it, that you want your consumers to be seeing. And then continuous monitoring. We had a saying that once could be an accident, twice could be a coincidence, 3 times and you got a pattern. And if you continue doing that forever into the future, you can in advance know if something has broken, know in advance if some failure condition has been met or not met. And you can respond to it much more rapidly for your API consumers that are depending on you. So, this is the little image of the tooling itself. We offer this through a little client that can be installed on your laptop, and it allows you to send a very simple call and request. You can get back the format, you can take a look at it, you can make sure that it has the content that you need. And not only can you do this on your desktop, which a lot of developers we've heard want to be able to do in case they're in a local environment, but we also offer this in a web client. And the value there is where it really connects into something more powerful and where we start to see the aha moment. And that's with the inspection and validation that we offer. So not only can you choose and define your own rules and say, when I get this response, I want it to be a 200 OK. I want to make sure that the format is a JSON format. I want to make sure that it's in an array. I want to make sure that entries that say email are actually emails. Well, you can do all that yourself, or you can send a call and response, and the software will generate that for you. It'll take a guess at what it thinks you want just based on the response you've gotten and create that test, and you can then edit it either in a graphical user interface or in some code if that's where you're more familiar. So in this way, you can really narrow down to inspect what you expect out of your call and response so you can see it as your consumer would. And one important thing I want to touch on before moving on to monitoring is you want to test both your success conditions and your failure conditions. We were just talking about how it might be possible for an attacker to call your API without a token. Well, create a monitor that does that. Create a test that calls your API without a token. See what happens. Create one that calls it with a token. See what happens. Create one that exceeds its rate limit. Create one that does not exceed its rate limit. Make sure that you test each condition that you can imagine your legitimate API consumer or an attacking API consumer may choose to use so that you inspect what you expect to happen. Then we get to monitoring. So once you've already defined all these, once you've either used the software tooling to create this for you, or you've gone through and edited it carefully, or you've even taken the time and effort to do it all yourself. Well, remember we talked about how once could be an accident and twice, well, that could be a coincidence, 3 times and you got a pattern. Well, how about hundreds of times? How about every 30 minutes, every day, every year, forever? And tell me if anything goes wrong. Well, then you've got yourself a real powerful and robust pattern. And you can keep watching this and be notified if anything changes. So, yeah, screenshots are nice, right? But video didn't happen. I could do this in a web UI, and I do have a demo later that I invite you all to come and look at, but I want to show you it running, just to talk through it a little bit. So this is the HTTP client on the web that I talked about. You can put in your URL, perform your operation, add the parameters that you need, send the request. And you can do that pre-combat check and just look at it and make sure that it has what you wanted. It looks like what it's supposed to look like. You can look at it raw if you prefer it instead of parsed. Well then, after you've saved it, and you can call it again at any time if you want to manually by clicking a button, like some of our good friends have you do. You can also click this button to generate a test, and this is what I talked about as what we've often seen as the aha moment that people really like. After you've given it a name and you've assigned it to a project, when you generate the test, it's going to go and look at what you've received, and it's going to assume for you, hey, I think you want to get, I think you want your payload to be a JSON, I think you want it to be an array, I think you want your email to be email, I think that you want your URL to be an image. And then you can modify it either in this GUI or in code. Then you can set it to run that test and continue the monitoring. You can dig down into the test, into any detail you want, but you don't have to. It's up to you. How deeply you want to inspect what you expect here. How much you want to delve into the details. And now we're getting to the part that I skipped ahead to a little bit before. This is where, once you've run that test once, you can publish it out and schedule it. And you can do this very simply. This total video is 90 seconds from start to finish, and all it involved was posting in a URL with the right keys, sending the call, and then running through the tooling to set this up. And now my colleague has created a monitor that every 30 minutes, forever, is going to go and check this. So he sent that call, he looked at the test, he decided he didn't want to make modifications to it, and then he set it up to monitor the whole time. So I want to bring it back to API Connect's why. So remember that our why is to create software that helps enterprises, developers, companies make APIs that are simultaneously both secure and open. And that's why we've gone out and created API Connect and Test and Monitor and made the modifications to it that we have. You see, we have fellow travelers and allies out there that some people might call competitors, but I don't see it that way. They have different whys. They have different purposes behind what they do. Ours is here. It's to help secure and open at the same time. Now, part of that is you've got to understand what those APIs look like to a consumer, whether they be a friendly or an attacking consumer. And that's what we've created a software to scalably and simply do. That may not meet everybody's needs, but if this sounds like something that's necessary, it's pretty easy to check it out. The message I want to leave is this. I don't think I need to convince anybody in here about the importance of APIs, or that APIs are eating the world, or that it's important to have good tooling for it, or that it's needed to have security, that you should be testing and monitoring. I think everybody in here probably generally agrees on that, just by virtue of being at this place. But what you may need is another story and another way of putting this to somebody else back at your organization when you're talking. What's another valuable way of presenting this information to them that could get the buy-in you need to get additional funding, to get additional resourcing, to get additional attention onto a project related to this? And inspecting what you expect, I think, is a really useful framework for it. So do your hello world check. Does it respond? Does it have what it needs? Inspect and validate it in more detail. Are the responses what you wanted them to be? Is the payload correct? Does it continue to be correct? Keep monitoring on that into the future. So what does testing and monitoring your APIs have to do with stepping off on a patrol with US Marines? Well, you have to inspect what you expect. And that kind of applies to all of life, really. I haven't taken all my time, so I'm not going to stretch it out any more than I need to. I will say thank you. I'll mention that if you'd like to check it out, we'd welcome you to. It's free. And let us know what you think. We're really open to feedback and interested in it. We're trying some experiments here that go outside of our normal comfort zone. So thank you very much, and please find me if you want to chat about inspecting what you expect, whether in the Marine Corps or with APIs. Thanks.